It was a quiet evening, and I had just settled into the living room, expecting the usual routine of a calm end to the day. My wife approached me with an expression I couldn't quite read. She motioned for me to sit down on the couch, and I complied, curious about what she had on her mind. Without much preamble, she declared that she wanted to have a serious conversation. It wasn't the sort of thing I expected to hear. We've always kept things straightforward and focused. But she seemed resolute, so I listened. She started by saying that our life had become too predictable, too routine. Her words were direct, almost rehearsed. She didn't mince words about how the monotony was getting to her. I'll admit, I didn't immediately agree. Routine wasn't something I ever thought of as a bad thing. It meant stability. It meant control. But she wasn't asking for my opinion on that. She was already diving into what she thought we needed, a goal. Something big to work toward. She explained that she'd been thinking about it for a while, and she'd come to the conclusion that we should aim to buy a new house. A bigger one, somewhere with more space, something more inspiring than our current apartment. I sat back and asked her how she expected us to afford that. Our apartment, even if we sold it, wouldn't come close to covering the cost of a new house. It was a practical question, and I expected a practical answer. She didn't seem fazed. She told me she'd already started planning for this, and apparently, she had more than a few ideas. First, she mentioned a savings jar she'd been keeping, her dream fund, as she called it. She claimed it had a decent amount in it, though I hadn't realized she'd been putting money aside like that. I was surprised, but didn't interrupt. Next, she brought up something that caught me off guard. She said she'd been speaking with her best friend, and together they'd come up with a potential solution. My wife mentioned that her friend's husband worked at a company that was looking to fill some engineering roles, the kind of work I was qualified for. She added that there was even a remote position she could take to contribute financially. She laid it out like it was the perfect opportunity, new jobs, a steady income boost, and a path to buying that house she wanted so much. I asked her how she came to think this would all fall into place so easily. After all, we've been married for years, and she'd never brought up wanting to move before. She'd seemed content with the apartment, especially after I'd spent countless hours fixing it up to her liking. From painting the walls to installing shelving exactly as she'd envisioned, I'd poured my effort into making our home just right. What changed? Her answer was almost dismissive. She told me she'd recently taken a motivational course online, and it had inspired her to think bigger. She wanted a future that included more than just dreaming, a house, a garden, a barbecue, the whole picture. I couldn't argue with her determination, but I wasn't entirely sold. It wasn't in my nature to jump into something this big without weighing the risks and logistics. I pointed out that a motivational course and some encouragement from her friend didn't guarantee success. I'm an engineer, not a dreamer. I work in facts and outcomes, not possibilities. But she countered with confidence, insisting that this could be the change we needed to break free from our routine. Finally, she proposed that we go to a coffee shop the next day to meet her friend and her husband. She wanted to discuss the job opportunities and get a clearer picture of how it could all work out. She was firm in her belief that this was worth exploring and that I should come along. I hesitated for a moment, not because I didn't care about her idea, but because I'm not one to rush into things. But I could see she wasn't going to let this go until I agreed. In the end, I nodded. All right, I said. Tomorrow, we'll meet your friends and see what they have to say. Let's hear their pitch. It was the logical next step, and I was willing to listen. For now, that was enough. The next day, as promised, we headed out to the coffee shop. My wife, true to form, took her time getting ready. It wasn't unusual, she liked to look her best, and I respected that, though I was left pacing by the door. After what felt like an eternity, we finally got into the car and drove off. Traffic wasn't terrible, and the coffee shop wasn't far, but I was already feeling like the day was off to a slow start. Still, I kept my thoughts to myself. When we arrived, the place was lively but not overcrowded. We found a table near the window, ordered coffee, and settled in to wait for her friends. They showed up shortly after, a couple who seemed friendly enough. The guy, her friend's husband, got straight to the point. He explained that he was familiar with the hiring manager at his company and had already discussed my wife's idea with his girlfriend. They both thought it was a solid plan, and he had even done some groundwork to get the details of the job. He described the position he had in mind for me. It involved maintaining and repairing specialized transmitters located in hard-to-reach areas. The job was field-based, requiring regular travel to different sites for inspections and maintenance. It was clear this wasn't a typical desk job. He mentioned that the schedule would be 3 days on and 3 days off, with occasional week-long assignments that paid double. As someone who prefers clear structure, the idea of a rotating schedule wasn't immediately appealing, but the pay he mentioned was significantly better than my current job. I asked a few pointed questions about the nature of the work, what kind of equipment, the level of responsibility, and the logistics of travel. He answered confidently, emphasizing the support and training provided. It sounded demanding but manageable. I admitted that it was worth considering, but noted that I would need time to transition from my current role. He understood and assured me there was no rush, but encouraged me to make a decision soon, as the company was eager to fill the position. The conversation shifted to my wife's potential role. They explained that it was a remote position focused on managing data in Google Sheets and processing applications. It was straightforward work, but didn't pay nearly as much as my role would. My wife, however, seemed undeterred. She said she was fine with that, given that she'd never worked before, and this would be her first step toward contributing financially. I appreciated her willingness to try, even if the job seemed more about supporting the overall plan than fulfilling her personally. Toward the end of the conversation, her friend's husband brought up an upcoming corporate event. He suggested it would be a good opportunity for us to meet the team and get a feel for the workplace culture. He warned us that the team had its share of quirky personalities, students, programmers, and other young professionals with peculiar interests. They're a good bunch, he said, but don't be surprised if some of them are unconventional. I didn't comment, but I made a mental note to keep an eye out. The event sounded casual but necessary. It was clear they wanted us to socialize with the team before we committed. My wife seemed enthusiastic about the idea, viewing it as an adventure. I, on the other hand, wasn't particularly excited about mingling with strangers, but I knew it was part of the process. Meeting the team would give me a chance to gauge the workplace firsthand, so I agreed. By the time we finished our coffee, the conversation had covered everything we needed. We got the details about the event, thanked them for their time, and wrapped things up. My wife was in high spirits as we left the coffee shop, clearly feeling optimistic about the opportunity. I remained reserved, but decided to stay open-minded for now. We drove home, discussing the logistics of attending the corporate event and what to expect. After we got back home from the coffee shop, my wife and I sat down to talk about everything. She was brimming with excitement, going on about how promising the whole opportunity seemed. I was less enthusiastic. While the salary for the job was undeniably appealing, the idea of a 3 days on, 3 days off schedule didn't sit right with me. It felt like a disruption to the routine I valued. But what really stuck with me was the comment about the team's strange interests. I told her it made me curious, though not necessarily in a good way. My wife, however, was more optimistic. She thought it would be fun to meet everyone and maybe even make some friends. Her excitement was contagious, but I still had my reservations. Over the next 2 weeks, I focused on wrapping up my responsibilities at my current job. It wasn't a place I was overly attached to, but leaving still felt like a big step. By the end of that period, I had handed in my resignation and was officially ready to start the new role. It felt like a gamble, but one I was willing to take for the sake of the financial benefits. My wife was thrilled that we were moving forward with the plan. She even started looking into the details of her remote position, diving headfirst into learning how to manage spreadsheets and applications. She was determined, and I respected that. The day of the corporate event came quickly. My wife and I arrived at the venue, and the atmosphere was lively. It was clear they had put effort into making the gathering welcoming and upbeat. As soon as we walked in, we were greeted warmly by several employees. Drinks were offered, introductions were made, and the evening seemed to be off to a good start. However, it didn't take long for something unusual to happen. One young man, clearly intoxicated, stumbled up to us and blurted out a wildly inappropriate comment about when we'd be having sex. I was caught off guard, but I stayed composed. Before I could say or do anything, another employee pulled the drunk guy away and apologized profusely. The apologetic man, who seemed level-headed, explained that the guy had simply had too much to drink. I told him it was fine, though I admitted I had been tempted to handle the situation more directly. We laughed it off, and the conversation shifted to introductions. The man who had intervened turned out to work in the same role I was stepping into. He explained that we'd be alternating shifts, covering each other's 3-day cycles. It was helpful to hear his perspective on the job, and I found myself feeling slightly more at ease. Meanwhile, my wife was busy chatting with others. She was in her element, effortlessly striking up conversations and making connections. I couldn't help but notice a group of young men at another table who seemed fixated on us. Their drunken stares were hard to miss. I leaned over to my new acquaintance and asked what their deal was. He chuckled and explained that they were recent college graduates working in a different department. "They're harmless," he said, "just immature and a bit too eager to make an impression." His relaxed attitude reassured me, though I still kept an eye on them. As the evening progressed, more people joined our table, and the conversations became livelier. My wife seemed to hit it off with nearly everyone she met, and I found myself loosening up as well. The event turned out to be less formal than I had anticipated, which helped me relax. The young men from earlier didn't cause any trouble beyond their occasional loud laughter and clumsy attempts to mingle. For the most part, the night was shaping up to be a positive experience. A couple more colleagues joined us as the evening wore on, including one who shared some valuable tips about managing the fieldwork I'd soon be taking on. It was practical advice that I appreciated. My wife's conversations, on the other hand, seemed more social than work-related, but I could tell she was enjoying herself. She's always been more outgoing than me, and tonight was no exception. I didn't mind, though it was good to see her so engaged. As the event began winding down, we made our rounds to say goodbye. Most people seemed genuinely friendly, and a few even expressed excitement about us joining the team. I'd come into the evening with low expectations, but it ended on a surprisingly positive note. We thanked everyone for the warm welcome and headed home. On the drive back, my wife was already buzzing with ideas about the people she'd met and how this new chapter could unfold. I stayed quiet, reflecting on the night and preparing for what lay ahead. When we got home after the corporate event, I sat down with my wife to talk about everything we'd seen and heard. I mentioned how glad I was that she'd be working from home. "Some of the guys there seem like trouble," I said, referencing the stories I'd heard and the behavior I'd witnessed. She laughed it off, reminding me that we'd all been young and impulsive at some point. "They're just fresh out of college," she said. "They'll grow out of it." I wasn't entirely convinced, but decided to let it go for now. She then mentioned that she needed to go to the office soon to pick up her work laptop. "You'll be on shift, so it works out," she added. "When you're back, you can tell me how your first full cycle went." 3 days later, after finishing my shift, I came home to find her asleep at the table with her new laptop open in front of her. She looked content, like someone who had just checked off an important task. I gently shook her awake and asked how her day had gone. "Great," she said with a grin. "I got to catch up with some of the guys from the event." Her casual tone threw me off. I asked her who exactly she'd seen, and she explained that she and her friend had gone out for coffee and bumped into a group of people from the corporate event. She mentioned how some of them had been at the same table as us during the event. Apparently, they recognized her and invited themselves to join her and her friend. Among them was the same guy who had made the inappropriate comment about sex on the night of the event. Hearing that, I couldn't help but feel irritated. "And what did he have to say this time?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. She laughed, brushing it off as nothing. He barely said a word. Probably embarrassed about last time, she said. Relax, Rambo. That didn't make me feel any better. I told her that if it hadn't been for the guy who stepped in, I might have decked him that night. She rolled her eyes, dismissing my comment as overprotective. Anyway, she continued, we ended up talking for a while. They even came over afterward. One of them gave me a ride back and dropped off the laptop. That last part caught me off guard. They came to the house? I asked. She nodded like it was no big deal. We had pizza, talked a bit, and then they left. Nothing dramatic. I couldn't hide my frustration. Why didn't you tell me? I asked. Her answer was almost too casual. I didn't think it was a big deal, she said. I was with my friend the whole time. What's there to worry about? Her nonchalant attitude didn't sit well with me, but I decided not to escalate things. It's just weird, I told her. Inviting them over without letting me know. But what's done is done. She could tell I wasn't entirely comfortable. If it bothers you that much, she said, we can invite them over again so you can meet them properly. Maybe then you'll see they're not so bad. I wasn't thrilled about the idea, but saw the logic in it. Fine, I said. But if they're going to hang around, I'll decide whether they're worth keeping around. She smirked. You're already so skeptical, she said. Let's see if you change your mind after meeting them again. I didn't reply right away, thinking about what kind of impression they'd left on me at the event. Finally, I said, maybe I am skeptical. But we'll see soon enough. A week later, my wife invited the group over to our place, as planned. They arrived on time, and at first, everything seemed to go smoothly. The guys were polite, even going as far as apologizing for any inappropriate behavior at the corporate event. I appreciated the gesture, though I remained cautious. I wasn't the type to let my guard down easily, especially around people I didn't know well. Still, I kept my observations to myself and let the evening play out. As the night went on, something began to feel off. One of the guys couldn't seem to keep his eyes off my wife. It was subtle at first, but as time passed, his lingering glances became hard to ignore. I watched him carefully, trying not to make a scene, but it was clear that his attention was more than casual. My wife, oblivious or simply unbothered, continued chatting with everyone as if nothing was amiss. I stayed silent, but my unease grew. Later in the evening, another guy seemed to latch onto her in conversation. He stood close, laughing at everything she said, and didn't stray far from her side. I finally had enough and decided to intervene. I walked over and asked him directly what he was doing. He looked startled but managed to respond, saying my wife was a fantastic conversationalist and that they had mutual friends. I nodded but didn't back off. My presence was enough to make him uncomfortable, and soon he found an excuse to move away. The rest of the evening went by without any major incidents, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the group. Once the guests left, I turned to my wife and told her exactly how I felt. They might act nice on the surface, but one of them couldn't stop staring at you, and another wouldn't leave you alone, I said. She brushed it off, accusing me of overreacting. You're imagining things, she said. They were just being friendly. I wasn't convinced. Friendly or not, I'm telling you, something's not right with them. I don't want you spending time with them anymore, I said firmly. My wife was clearly upset by my stance. She argued that I was being unreasonable and overly controlling, but I stood my ground. I'm serious, I told her. If they're going to keep acting this way, I don't want them around. Despite my objections, life moved on. Soon, I noticed a new pattern. Whenever I was away for work, my wife would sometimes miss my calls or take longer than usual to reply to messages. It happened often enough to raise my suspicions. When I got home one evening, I asked her about it directly. She shrugged and said it was a coincidence. You're reading too much into it, she said. Sometimes I'm just busy. A new assignment came up, requiring me to spend 5 days traveling between multiple sites. Before leaving, I made sure everything at home was in order. During the trip, the same pattern repeated: missed calls and delayed replies. When I finally managed to reach her, I asked her again why she wasn't answering. This time, she had a different explanation. "Someone brought me a puppy," she said casually. "I've been taking care of it and taking it for walks." Her explanation caught me off guard. I didn't know what to make of it. The tone in her voice was calm, almost dismissive, as if she didn't see why I'd even question her. Frustrated but unwilling to argue, I ended the call abruptly. "All right," I said. "I'll talk to you later." I hung up, unable to shake the feeling that there was more to the story than she was letting on. I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that my wife's explanation about the puppy didn't add up. Her behavior had been inconsistent, and I decided it was time to stop relying on words alone. Our neighborhood had accessible street cameras, and I used the system to take a closer look at her claimed dog-walking routine. As I reviewed the footage, what I saw left me in disbelief. There she was, not walking a dog, but disposing of a shocking number of used condoms into a nearby trash bin. My stomach churned at the sight, and I struggled to process what it meant. The volume alone was enough to confirm my worst fears. Fueled by adrenaline and rage, I made a snap decision to confront the situation head-on. I worked tirelessly to finish my assignment a day ahead of schedule. Sleep was out of the question as my mind raced with anger and disbelief. The moment I clocked out, I jumped into my car and sped home, determined to get answers. As I approached the house, I noticed the absence of cars outside. That gave me some pause, a group large enough for what I feared wouldn't have arrived on foot. Still, I wasn't about to let that stop me. I parked a few blocks away, walked quietly to the house, and entered the garage, hiding there to observe. Hours passed, and the evening settled in. My patience was tested, but I stayed alert, waiting for any sign of activity. Finally, I heard the unmistakable sound of a car pulling up. I waited another 30 minutes, ensuring I wouldn't interrupt prematurely. Then, faint but clear through the quiet night, I heard sounds from inside the house, intimate noises that erased any lingering doubt. My heart pounded as I gritted my teeth, steadying myself for what I was about to do. I returned to my car, retrieved my pistol from the glove compartment, and walked straight to the house. My mind was singularly focused on the confrontation ahead. Inside, I found what I dreaded most: is my wife, completely unclothed, surrounded by several men in various states of undress. The scene was chaotic, obscene, and undeniable. For a moment, the room froze as everyone realized I was standing there, weapon in hand. Without hesitation, I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures. The men scrambled, yelling over each other as they tried to gather their things and flee. I fired a single shot into the floor, stopping them in their tracks. "No one moves," I said, my voice steady but cold. The threat of the gun was enough to make them rethink their hasty exit, though it didn't stop them from trembling. As they backed toward the door, one of them tripped, landing flat on the floor. I immediately trained my weapon on him. He looked up at me, wide-eyed and terrified. It was then that I recognized him, one of my co-workers from the corporate event, the guy with the alternating schedule. "You," I said, my voice low and sharp. "Start talking. What the hell has been going on here, and how long has it been happening?" He stammered, trying to find the words, but I wasn't in the mood for delays. "Talk now, or I'll make sure you don't leave this house." Under the pressure, he spilled everything. They had been coming over regularly during my business trips. My wife had told them she was divorced, using my absences to keep up the charade. Each word he spoke felt like another blow, but I stayed silent, letting him finish. When he was done, I glanced at my wife, who stood frozen, a mix of fear and guilt written across her face. I turned back to the man and gestured toward the door with the barrel of the gun. "Get out," I said. He scrambled to his feet and ran, leaving his shoes behind in his haste. Then I faced my wife. The silence between us was heavy, but I finally broke it. "So, you told them we were divorced?" "Good," I said. "Consider it true now." I didn't wait for a response. Get ready for the life you've earned, I added before walking out the door. I got back in my car and drove straight to my best friend's house. He was someone I could trust, and I knew I needed his advice for what came next. Whatever happened, I was done with her lies and betrayal. When I arrived at my best friend's house, he greeted me with the calm professionalism that I'd always admired. He was not just a friend, but also a highly skilled lawyer. After hearing everything I had to say, he sat back, his expression thoughtful. "You have everything you need to ensure a favorable outcome," he said. "The photos, the eyewitness account, it all supports your case. Now, let's talk about leaving her with nothing." His bluntness was refreshing. I wasn't in the mood for platitudes or sugarcoating. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Do you remember how you once told me about that savings jar your wife has? The one she's been adding to for years?" I nodded. It was something she had always been proud of, though she rarely mentioned it directly. "If that money hasn't been declared anywhere, no bank records, no paper trail, you can take it, and no one will be able to prove it was ever there to begin with," he explained. "That gives you leverage and ensures she doesn't walk away with anything substantial." I was silent for a moment, letting the idea sink in. It wasn't a decision I took lightly, but I couldn't deny the logic. "While I work on the legal side of things," he continued, "you need to go back home and act as if nothing's wrong. Play along. It'll give us the time we need to prepare everything, and it'll keep her from getting suspicious. If she scrambles to find a lawyer in a hurry, all the better for us." Reluctantly, I agreed. The thought of pretending everything was fine made my stomach turn, but I trusted his judgment. That evening, I returned home, steeling myself for the performance ahead. As soon as I walked through the door, she rushed toward me, tears streaming down her face. She dropped to her knees, clutching at my hands, and begged for forgiveness. Her desperation was palpable, but it only deepened my resolve. "We'll see," I said curtly. "There's a lot to think about." Her relief was almost immediate, as though my measured response gave her hope. She stood and wiped her face, trying to compose herself. I couldn't stand the sight of her at that moment, but I knew I had to stay focused on the bigger picture. Over dinner, she made every effort to win me over, talking about how she wanted to make things right and rebuild our relationship. I nodded where appropriate, but kept my answers short, letting her do most of the talking. Later that night, as we lay in bed, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. She had fallen asleep quickly, as if the weight of her guilt had finally exhausted her. I, on the other hand, couldn't rest. The memory of her betrayal played on a loop in my head, but so did my friend's words. I needed to plan my next steps carefully. Taking the savings jar would be tricky, I had to find it first, and I couldn't risk her noticing its absence too soon. The next morning, I watched her closely as she went about her routine. She seemed determined to act like the perfect wife, cooking breakfast and asking about my plans for the day. I played along, giving vague answers and pretending to appreciate her efforts. Internally, I was mapping out every corner of the house, trying to recall where she might have hidden the jar. It wasn't something she'd leave out in the open. As the day went on, I started piecing together my approach. I'd wait for an opportunity when she wasn't home, a grocery trip, perhaps, to conduct a thorough search. In the meantime, I had to maintain the facade of reconciliation. It was a difficult act to keep up, but every moment of discomfort was a reminder of what I stood to gain. That night, as I lay awake again, I began to finalize my plan. The sooner I acted, the sooner I could close this chapter and move on with my life. When my wife left for her usual grocery run, I knew it was the perfect moment to act. The house was quiet, and I had enough time to conduct a thorough search without interruption. Starting in the bedroom, I checked her drawers and under the bed but found nothing unusual. From there, I moved to the living room and then the closets, methodically working through each space. It wasn't until I reached the storage room that I found what I was looking for. Tucked away in the back, hidden among old showboxes and forgotten knickknacks, were several large jars, each filled to the brim with neatly stacked $100 bills. The sight was both shocking and satisfying. I unscrewed the lid of one jar to confirm its contents, and the crisp bills inside left no doubt. There were at least 5 jars, all equally packed. Memories flooded back as I stood there, recalling how her parents had occasionally given her money over the years, urging her to save it for a rainy day. She'd always been discreet about it, but I hadn't realized just how much she'd accumulated. The amount was staggering, far beyond what I'd expected. For a moment, I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. Her betrayal might have cost me emotionally, but at least this would ensure she didn't come out ahead. I quickly got to work. Each jar was carefully placed back into its box, and I wrapped the boxes in old cloth to disguise them further. The last thing I needed was for her to notice anything missing too soon. Once the jars were secure, I carried them out to the car, taking care not to draw attention. As I closed the trunk, I sent her a quick message. "My dad called," I wrote. "He needs me to bring over a drill. I'll be back in a bit." It was a believable excuse, one that wouldn't raise suspicion. The drive to my parents' house felt longer than usual, though I wasn't in a rush. When I arrived, they greeted me warmly, though their expressions turned serious as I began explaining the situation. I laid it all out for them, her infidelity, the jars of money, and the plan my lawyer friend had suggested. They were shocked but supportive. "We'll take care of it," my father said firmly. "No one will find this here." My mother nodded, her face set with determination. I could trust them to keep the money hidden, knowing they'd do whatever it took to help me. Leaving the jars with them gave me a sense of relief, but it didn't erase the heaviness in my chest. As I drove back home, I rehearsed what I would say if she asked where I'd been. Fortunately, she rarely pressed for details, so I doubted she'd question my story. When I walked through the door, she was already back from the store, putting away groceries. "How'd it go?" she asked, her tone casual. "Fine," I replied. "My dad's all set now." She seemed satisfied with the answer and went back to unpacking. The days that followed were some of the most difficult I'd ever endured. Living under the same roof as her, pretending everything was normal, felt like a betrayal of myself. Every smile she gave me, every attempt to win me over, only deepened the resentment I felt. But I reminded myself that this was temporary. The documents were being prepared, and soon, I'd have everything I needed to end this nightmare on my terms. At night, I'd lie awake, running through the plan in my head. I thought about the money, safely tucked away at my parents' house, and how it would play into the larger scheme. It wasn't just about taking what was hers, it was about ensuring she didn't have the means to disrupt my life any further. Every detail had to be perfect. There was no room for mistakes. She, meanwhile, seemed oblivious. If she suspected anything, she didn't show it. Her demeanor was almost cheerful, as though she believed she'd truly earned my forgiveness. Watching her act so carefree only strengthened my resolve. This wasn't a partnership anymore, it was a charade, and I was determined to see it through to the end. For now, I played my role, keeping my emotions in check and focusing on the tasks at hand. Though it weighed heavily on me, I continued to live my life as though nothing had changed. Each day brought me closer to the moment when the truth would come out and the scales would finally tip in my favor. Until then, I endured, knowing that every sacrifice I made now would be worth it in the end. A few days before our wedding anniversary, my phone buzzed with a call from my best friend, the lawyer. "The documents are ready," he said, his voice calm and steady. "You can serve her whenever you're ready." I thanked him and hung up, my mind immediately shifting to the perfect way to deliver the papers. The timing couldn't have been better. With our anniversary just around the corner, I decided it was fitting to turn the occasion into a final statement. This wasn't just about ending the marriage, it was about reclaiming control. I spent the next day preparing the presentation. I found a massive cardboard box and carefully placed the divorce papers at the very bottom. Then, I surrounded them with layers of smaller boxes, each one meticulously taped and nested inside the next. The final result was a matryoshka of frustration, designed to force her to spend time unwrapping her fate. By the time I was done, the package was enormous, almost comical in size. It was exactly what I wanted, a mix of absurdity and cold finality. When the day arrived, I kept my demeanor calm and collected. She greeted me that morning with a smile, clearly hoping to use the anniversary as a way to further mend the cracks she'd caused. I played along, acting as though I was on board with the charade. "I have a surprise for you," I said casually, watching as her eyes lit up with anticipation. I asked her to wait in the living room while I went outside to retrieve the box. It was heavy, but adrenaline made it easier to carry as I brought it in and placed it in front of her. "What is this?" she asked, laughing nervously as she inspected the oversized package. "Your gift," I said simply. "Go ahead, open it." She hesitated for a moment, likely trying to gauge my mood, but then began tearing into the layers. Each box she uncovered revealed yet another box, and her laughter turned to mild irritation as the process dragged on. "What is this, some kind of joke?" she asked, looking up at me. I just shrugged. "Keep going," I said. It took her nearly 30 minutes to reach the final box. By then, her initial excitement had given way to frustration. When she opened the last box and pulled out the divorce papers, her expression froze. The color drained from her face as she stared at the documents, her hands trembling slightly. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You told everyone we were divorced already," I replied coldly. "Now it's official. Consider this my confirmation." Her reaction was immediate and explosive. She threw the papers onto the floor and began yelling, calling me every name under the sun. "This is a joke, right?" she screamed, her voice rising with each word. When she realized I wasn't joking, she lunged at me, fists raised. I caught her wrists mid-swing and pushed her back firmly but without violence. "Don't even try it," I warned, my tone as icy as my resolve. She broke down into tears, switching tactics from rage to pleading. I stood unmoved, watching as she cycled through emotions, trying to find a crack in my armor. When it became clear that I wasn't going to relent, she accused me of being heartless, of throwing away everything we'd built. I laughed bitterly at that, shaking my head. "You threw it away the moment you brought strangers into our home," I said. "This is the life you chose. Now it's time to live with it." Without another word, I walked to the bedroom and began gathering her things. One by one, I tossed them into the hallway, not caring about the mess. She followed behind me, screaming and crying, but I didn't stop. By the time I was done, her belongings were piled outside the front door. I opened it and gestured for her to leave. "Your new home is out there," I said coldly. "The same place you discarded everything we had. Consider it poetic justice." She stood there for a moment, stunned, before finally stepping outside. I closed the door behind her without another word, sealing the chapter on our life together. The first thing I did after throwing her out was change the locks on every door. I wasn't about to take any chances. She was unpredictable, and I wouldn't put it past her to try and sneak back in, either to retrieve something or to cause trouble. The locksmith came the very next morning, and within an hour, the house was secure. I felt a small measure of relief knowing that she no longer had unrestricted access to the place. Whatever she planned next, it wouldn't involve walking back through my front door uninvited. Sure enough, it didn't take long for her to return. She tried the door multiple times over the following days, rattling the handle and sometimes knocking loudly. I ignored her every attempt, standing just out of sight and waiting for her to leave. But she wasn't one to give up easily. A week later, she arrived with the police in tow, claiming that I had stolen her money and unlawfully locked her out of the house. It was the dramatic entrance I'd been expecting. When the officers knocked, I opened the door calmly, greeting them with the collected demeanor of a man who had nothing to hide. My ex-wife, on the other hand, was yelling and pointing, accusing me of theft and demanding they force me to let her in. "He took everything," she shouted. "You have to search the house. He's hiding my money in there." One of the officers turned to me, clearly skeptical, but obligated to investigate. "Sir, do you mind if we take a look around?" he asked. I nodded without hesitation. "Go right ahead," I said. "But before you do, let me explain the situation." I told them about her infidelity, her violent outburst, and the photos I had taken to document everything. I kicked her out because she tried to hit me after I confronted her about her affairs, I said, handing over my phone to show them the evidence. The officers scrolled through the pictures, their expressions hardening as they took in the details. I've done nothing illegal. She's the one who's been dishonest from the start. They agreed to check the house anyway, as she insisted there were jars full of stolen money hidden somewhere. I led them to the storage closet, opening it with a calm flourish. Inside were the same old showboxes I had placed there earlier, now filled with worn-out boots and sneakers. One officer picked up a box and opened it, finding nothing remotely suspicious. My ex-wife was livid. They were here, she screamed. He must have moved them. The officers exchanged a glance, clearly unimpressed. One of them said, his tone firm but polite. Unless you have concrete evidence to support your claims, there's nothing we can do here. You can't just accuse someone without proof. She tried to argue, bringing up her parents and how they had given her the money over the years. The officers, however, pointed out that there was no record of these funds and no evidence linking them to me. Even if what you're saying is true, one officer added, it doesn't change the fact that you've been removed from this property by the owner. Her frustration boiled over, and she began hurling insults at me, accusing the officers of taking my side unfairly. They remained professional, but it was clear they were losing patience. Listen, one officer said, cutting through her tirade. We've seen the evidence, and from where we stand, you're the one who's in the wrong here. It's time for you to leave. She opened her mouth to argue again, but seemed to think better of it. With a final glare in my direction, she stormed out of the house. I stood by the door as the officers escorted her to the street. One of them turned back to me, offering a nod. We'll file a report, he said. If she comes back again, give us a call. I thanked them and watched as they drove off, leaving her standing alone on the sidewalk. She hesitated for a moment, as if considering her next move, but eventually walked away, muttering under her breath. The house was silent again, and I locked the door with a deep sense of finality. The confrontation had been draining, but it was another step toward putting this chapter behind me. She'd tried every trick in the book to regain control, but none of it had worked. I'd planned carefully, anticipated her moves, and stayed one step ahead. As I sat down to catch my breath, I felt a grim satisfaction knowing she was gone, at least for now. The divorce went as smoothly as my lawyer friend had promised. It wasn't his first case involving infidelity and financial disputes, so he navigated the process with ease. The evidence I had gathered made my position unassailable. Between the photographs, the testimony, and her history of erratic behavior, she didn't stand a chance. True to his word, my friend ensured the legal proceedings were swift and decisive, even giving me a significant discount as a gesture of friendship. To show my appreciation, I discreetly used a portion of the hidden money I'd recovered to thank him for his work. It felt like poetic justice, turning her hoarded funds into something constructive. Once the legalities were finalized, I wasted no time in selling the house. It had become a symbol of everything that had gone wrong, and I wanted nothing more than to leave it behind. The market was favorable, and the property sold quickly. With the proceeds, I purchased a private house in another part of the city, far from the memories and people associated with my old life. The new house was everything I needed, peaceful, spacious, and a fresh start in every sense of the word. It was a place where I could rebuild without the shadows of the past looming over me. With my living situation resolved, I turned my attention to my career. The job I had taken as part of the initial plan with my ex-wife no longer held any appeal. The long hours and demanding schedule weren't worth the effort, especially now that I had a financial cushion to fall back on. I resigned and returned to my previous workplace, where the workload was lighter and the pay, while modest, was more than enough to cover my needs. The familiarity of the old job was a welcome change, offering stability and a sense of normalcy that I hadn't realized I'd missed. At the suggestion of some friends, I decided to put the remaining money to work. I hired a financial analyst, someone with a proven track record, to guide me through the process of investing. Together, we built a diversified portfolio, focusing on stocks with steady growth potential and reliable dividends. It wasn't a get-rich-quick scheme, but that wasn't what I was looking for. I wanted stability and the assurance that I could live comfortably without worrying about my finances. The strategy worked, and within months, I began to see the benefits of a passive income stream. As I settled into my new life, I made it a point to address the connections my ex-wife might exploit. I spoke to my parents first, explaining everything in detail so they would be prepared if she tried to contact them. They were supportive and promised not to engage with her under any circumstances. I then reached out to mutual friends, sharing enough of the story to ensure they understood why I wanted no contact with her. Everyone was understanding and cooperative, cutting off ties with her at my request. Of course, she didn't take the hint. She made several attempts to reach out, starting with my parents. When that didn't work, she tried to use mutual friends as intermediaries. Each time, she was met with silence or polite refusal. Frustrated, she began calling me directly, leaving long-winded voicemails filled with accusations, pleas, and demands. She wanted to meet, to fix things, as if the damage she'd caused could simply be undone. I didn't respond. To me, there was nothing left to say. Her persistence didn't stop there. On one occasion, she showed up unannounced at my parents' house, hoping to catch them off guard. My father, a man of few words but firm principles, told her in no uncertain terms that she wasn't welcome. She left in a huff, but the encounter only reinforced my decision to warn everyone close to me. She could try all she wanted, but she wouldn't find a way back into my life through them. The phone calls kept coming, though they grew more sporadic over time. Each time her number appeared on the screen, I felt a mix of annoyance and pity. I'd moved on, both emotionally and practically, and her attempts to rekindle anything only highlighted how far removed I was from the person I'd been during our marriage. When she demanded answers or tried to guilt me into a conversation, I would simply hang up. When she left voicemails, I deleted them without listening. There was no point in entertaining her delusions. In the end, her efforts amounted to nothing. She had burned the bridges that connected her to my world, and I had no intention of rebuilding them. Every time she tried to pull me back, I sent a clear message: there was no going back, no reconciliation, and no place for her in the life I had rebuilt. Whatever she hoped to achieve, she would have to do it without me. And with each failed attempt, I felt a little more at peace, knowing that I had truly moved on.